The child hadn't cried in 21 days. Not when hunger gnawed through her belly like a living thing. Not when the Montana summer sun blistered her small shoulders raw. Not when the good people of Silver Creek stepped over her like she was nothing but dust on their boots. But there she sat, on the splintered steps of Peterson's General Store, knees pulled to her chest, arms wrapped around them like she was holding herself together. 8 years old, with hair the color of rust in dying sunlight, and eyes that had seen too much. Brown eyes that should have been full of childhood wonder, now empty as abandoned wells. It was the summer of 1879, and the heat had a way of cooking a man's patience right out of him. Jim Cole felt it in his bones as he rode into Silver Creek, dust caking his throat, sweat carving rivers through the grime on his face. 4 years of running. 4 years of looking over his shoulder. 4 years of waking up in strange towns with his dead daughter's name on his lips. He was tired. God, he was tired. The town wasn't much. A saloon with swinging doors that had seen better days. A general store with faded letters. A church steeple reaching toward heaven like it was begging for rain. Buildings lined the main street like crooked teeth in an old man's mouth, weathered gray by wind and time. Jim tied Thunder, his brown gelding, to the hitching post outside the general store. The horse's head hung low, defeated by 3 days of hard riding and the merciless heat. As Jim climbed the 3 steps to the door, he saw her. The girl pressed against the wall beside the entrance, so still she might have been part of the building itself. Her dress had once been blue, he thought, but sun and dirt had faded it to something colorless. Her feet were bare, the soles cracked and bleeding. But it was her eyes that stopped him. Those brown eyes, holding on to something he couldn't name, something that reminded him of the daughter he'd lost. Walk away, he told himself. This ain't your concern. Nothing here is your concern. You stay, you plant roots, and roots mean pain. Roots mean loss. He walked past her. Inside, the store was cooler, darker. A thin man behind the counter looked up with flat eyes that had stopped expecting anything good from the world. Help you? Coffee, flour, bacon, whatever jerky you've got. Jim's voice came out rougher than he intended. Too many days on the trail, too many nights sleeping on hard ground with one eye open. The storekeeper moved slowly, pulling items from shelves with mechanical precision. Jim found himself glancing back toward the door, toward where the girl sat in her terrible stillness. That child outside. The words escaped before he could stop them. She belonged to someone? The man's face tightened like a fist. Brennan girl. Father died near a month back. Fool fell from scaffolding at the new church, broke his neck clean through. And her mother? Dead years ago. Childbirth, I heard. The storekeeper slapped Jim's supplies on the counter. The girl's been sitting there 21 days now, waiting for her daddy to come back. Someone ought to tell her he ain't coming, but nobody wants that job. $2.40. Jim paid without speaking, gathered his things, walked toward the door. The mathematics of it turned over in his mind. 21 days. 3 weeks of a child sitting on steps, slowly starving, while an entire town pretended not to see. He made it all the way to Thunder, loaded the supplies, put his foot in the stirrup. "Mister?" Her voice was small, cracked from disuse. He turned. She hadn't moved from her spot, but she was looking at him now, really looking. "You dropped something." He glanced down. A penny lay in the dust, probably fallen from his pocket when he'd fumbled with the supplies. "Keep it," he said. "Don't want your charity." The words came sharp, surprising him. Jim picked up the penny, looked at it, looked at her. In another life, in another world, his Annie would be just about this age now. 9 years old, instead of forever 5. Forever calling for her papa through smoke and flames he couldn't reach. "When's the last time you ate?" She didn't answer, her jaw set in a hard line, stubborn as stone. "I asked you a question, girl, and I ain't answering it. Don't need your help. Don't need nobody's help." He should have been angry, should have mounted up and ridden out and never thought of her again. Instead, he found himself tying Thunder back to the rail, found himself walking back into that store, found himself buying bread and cheese and dried apples and a canteen of water. When he came back out, she was still there, still hadn't moved. He sat down on the steps, not next to her, that would spook her, but close enough. He set the food between them. "I ain't eating your food," she said. "Didn't say you had to." Jim bit into the bread, chewed slowly. "Maybe I'm hungry. Maybe I bought too much. Maybe I don't like eating alone." Minutes passed. Somewhere down the street a dog barked. A wagon rattled by, the driver not even glancing at the child who'd become part of the scenery. The sun beat down, relentless and uncaring. Finally, her hand reached out. Small fingers, dirt under the nails, trembling slightly. She took the cheese, bit into it with the careful control of someone who'd learned that eating too fast on an empty stomach brought nothing but pain. "This town killed my pa," she said between bites. Jim went still. "That's so." "They say he fell. Say it was an accident. But I saw them up there." Her voice didn't waver. "Saw Mr. Brennan and Mr. Hayes. They was arguing with Pa, pushing him. Then he fell." The bread turned to sawdust in Jim's mouth. "You telling me your father was murdered?" "I'm telling you what I saw." "Told the sheriff, too. Know what he said?" She mimicked a man's deep voice. "Child's imagination. Grief makes people see things." A cold fury began to build in Jim's chest. The kind of fury he hadn't felt since the night his house burned. Since the night he'd hunted down 2 of the 3 men who'd set that fire and put bullets in them both. "Where you been sleeping?" "Here, under the porch when it rains." She finished the cheese, reached for an apple with hands that shook. Not from hunger anymore, from exhaustion. From 21 days of heat and fear and the slow death of hope. "And nobody in this town offered you a bed?" "Mrs. Wells at the boarding house lets me wash up sometimes. Gives me scraps when she remembers." Rose's jaw tightened. "I don't need more than that. Pa's coming back." "Your pa's dead, child." The words came out harder than he intended. He saw her flinch, saw the armor crack for just a second, before she rebuilt it with the practiced ease of a survivor. "I know that," she whispered. "I know he's buried in the churchyard. I know he ain't coming back. But if I leave these steps, then it's real. Then I got nothing left of him. This is where he told me to wait. So I wait." Something broke inside Jim's chest. Something he'd kept locked away for 4 years, bound up tight with guilt and grief and the terrible weight of failure. He saw his Lily in those brown eyes, saw Annie reaching for him through flames he couldn't fight through fast enough. Always too late, forever too late. "What's your name?" he heard himself ask. "Rose. Rose Brennan." "I'm Jim." She looked at him with those eyes that had learned to measure people the way gunfighters measured each other. 8 years old, and already she'd learned to calculate worth and danger in a single glance. "You ain't from here," she said. "No." "Where you from?" "Everywhere. Nowhere." "That ain't an answer. It's the only one I got." Rose finished the apple, reached for the bread. Her hands were steadier now, but Jim could see the shadows under her eyes, dark as bruises. 21 days of waiting for the impossible. "Why'd you stop?" she asked suddenly. "Everyone else walks past. Why'd you stop?" Jim looked out at the street, at the people who kept their eyes forward, who'd turned a dying child into part of the landscape, invisible as the dust beneath their feet. "Because someone should have," he said finally. "Because someone should have, 3 weeks ago." "That ain't an answer either." "Maybe it's the truth." Thunder rumbled in the distance, the first storm in weeks, pushing down from the mountains. Jim could smell rain on the wind, could feel the pressure building. Rose looked at the darkening sky with something close to fear. "Storm's coming," Jim said. "Porch won't keep you dry tonight." "I have to wait here." "Your pa ain't coming back in a storm, girl. And he wouldn't want you drowning while you waited." Lightning split the sky, close enough to feel. Rose flinched, pressing harder against the wall. The first fat drops of rain began to fall, turning the dust to mud in seconds. "Rose!" Jim knelt in the gathering storm, rain soaking through his coat. "I know about waiting for people who ain't coming. Spent 4 years doing it myself. And I'm telling you, your pa would want you safe. He'd want you warm and dry and alive. You dying on these steps don't honor him. It just means the world took one more thing it had no right to take." She looked at him, rain streaming down her face, mixing with tears she'd probably deny. "Why do you care?" "Because you have her eyes," he thought. "Because you're stubborn like she was. Because I couldn't save her, but maybe I can save you." "Because I do," he said. "That's all I got. Because I do." Her hand slipped into his, small and cold and trembling, but trusting. He carried her across the street, through the mud and rain, up onto the porch of Wells' boarding house, where a gray-haired woman waited with towels and questions in her eyes. 3 hours later, Rose sat by the fire in clean clothes, eating hot soup with the slow carefulness of someone whose stomach had forgotten what food felt like. Jim sat across from her, coffee going cold in his hands, watching her come back to life, one spoonful at a time. "Mr. Cole?" "Jim. Just Jim." "Jim." She set down the spoon, those brown eyes finding his across the firelight. "Why did you really stop? You could have kept writing." The truth sat heavy on his tongue. 4 years of running from it, and here it was, demanded by a child who'd learned that lies were more dangerous than hard truths. "I had a daughter once," he said quietly. "Annie. She was 5 years old. And a wife, Sarah. 4 years back, men set fire to our house. Sarah got Annie to the window, passed her through to me. But the floor gave way before Sarah could climb out." His voice went rough as gravel. "I held my daughter and watched my wife burn. And there wasn't a damn thing I could do to stop it." Rose didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she did something that broke him. She took his hand. "I'm sorry about your family," she said. "I'm sorry you've been running. But maybe," she squeezed his fingers, "maybe you've run far enough." Mrs. Wells appeared in the doorway, lantern in hand. "I've made up the room. Mr. Cole, I trust you'll be staying more than one night?" Jim looked at Rose, at this fierce, broken, impossibly brave child who'd survived 3 weeks that should have killed her, who'd trusted him when she had no reason to trust anyone. "Yeah," he said. "I'll be staying." Rose smiled then. Small, tentative, but real. The first real smile she'd worn in 21 days. But before either of them could speak again, Mrs. Wells' expression changed. She was looking past them, out the window, to where two men on expensive horses had stopped in the rain-soaked street. "That's Victor Brennan," she said, voice gone tight. "And Marcus Hayes. They've never come to my boarding house before." Jim stood slowly, his hand moving instinctively toward where his gun would be if he were wearing it. Through the window he could see them, one heavy-set and red-faced, the other lean and cold-eyed, both looking at the boarding house like predators who'd spotted prey. Rose's hand found Jim's again, gripping tight. "They're here because of me," she whispered. "Because you helped me. They always punish people who help me." "Let them come," Jim said, but his voice was steadier than his heart. The men didn't dismount. They sat their horses in the rain, looking at the boarding house for a long minute. Then, as one, they turned and rode away into the storm. But Jim knew what he'd seen in their faces. Recognition, calculation, threat. He'd made himself visible, made himself a target. And in a town where murder could be disguised as accident, where a child could starve on a street corner while good people walked past, visibility was dangerous. But as he looked down at Rose, at the hope beginning to kindle in those brown eyes, Jim knew he'd made his choice. For the first time in 4 years, he'd stopped running. And whatever came next, whatever price that choice demanded, he'd pay it, because some things were worth standing still for. Some things were worth fighting for. And this child, with her dead father, and her stubborn heart, and her terrible, beautiful courage, was one of them. Outside, the storm raged. Inside, a fire burned. And in that moment, Jim Cole made a promise, not to anyone else, but to himself, to the memory of Annie and Sarah, to the man he'd been before grief had made him a ghost. He would not walk away. He would not run. Not this time. Not from her. The game had begun. And Silver Creek was about to learn that some strangers were more dangerous than they appeared, especially the ones who'd already lost everything and had nothing left to fear. Morning came soft and golden, the storm having washed Silver Creek clean. Jim woke to find Rose already dressed, standing at the window of their shared room, watching the street below with the vigilance of a soldier on watch. "They're out there," she said without turning. "Mr. Brennan's men, 3 of them, been there since dawn." Jim joined her at the window. Sure enough, 3 riders sat their horses across the street, not hiding, not threatening, just present. A message as clear as a drawn gun. "We see you. We're watching." "Let them watch," Jim said. "We've got work to do." Over breakfast in Mrs. Wells' dining room, Jim laid out his plan. They needed proof. Rose's testimony alone wouldn't be enough. Not against men like Brennan and Hayes, not in a town that depended on their money. They needed a witness, an adult, someone who'd been there when Thomas Brennan fell. "There was someone," Rose said, pushing eggs around her plate. "Reverend Blackwood. He was at the church that day. I saw him from where I was hiding. He was standing in the doorway when it happened. He saw everything." Jim nodded slowly. "Then we talked to the Reverend." But Mrs. Wells shook her head, her face troubled. "Henry Blackwood won't help you. Can't help you. Victor Brennan's had a hold on him for near 10 years now. Caught him stealing from the church collection. Been using it to keep the Reverend quiet ever since." "Quiet about what?" "About everything. about the way Brennan and Hayes run this town, about the people they've crushed, about the debts they've manufactured and the land they've stolen. Mrs. Wells's hands trembled as she poured coffee. Henry's not a bad man, just a weak one, and weak men break easy under pressure. The church service that Sunday was thinly attended. Jim and Rose sat in the back pew, watching as Reverend Blackwood delivered a sermon about forgiveness that rang hollow in the small space. The man's hands shook when he gripped the pulpit. His eyes, when they briefly met Rose's, filled with something that looked like shame. After the service, Jim approached him as the last parishioners filed out. Blackwood was gathering his notes with the nervous energy of a man who wanted to be anywhere else. "Reverend, I need to speak with you about Thomas Brennan." The notes scattered across the floor. Blackwood knelt to gather them, not meeting Jim's eyes. "Terrible accident. We prayed for his soul. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have duties to attend to." "You were there." Jim's voice was quiet but firm. "The day he died. You saw what happened." Blackwood straightened, his face gone pale. "I was inside the church, working on the accounts. I didn't see anything." "Reverend?" Rose's voice was small but steady. "I saw you. You were standing in the doorway. You looked right up at the scaffolding when Pa fell. You saw Mr. Brennan grab Pa's arm. You saw Mr. Hayes push him." The man's face crumpled. For a moment, Jim thought he might confess, might unburden himself of the terrible weight he'd been carrying. But then Blackwood's eyes darted toward the church entrance, toward where one of Brennan's men sat on his horse, watching. "I saw nothing," Blackwood whispered. "May God forgive me, but I saw nothing. And you should stop asking questions, child, for your own sake." He gathered his scattered notes and fled toward the vestry like a man pursued by demons. Rose's small hand found Jim's. "He's scared." "Yeah, scared men don't make good witnesses." Jim looked at the rider outside, at the town beyond. "We need someone who isn't afraid. Someone with power of their own. There's only one man in Silver Creek who isn't afraid of Brennan and Hayes," Mrs. Wells said from behind them. They hadn't heard her approach. "Judge Samuel Holloway. He owns the Circle H Ranch, 6 miles out. Richest man in the territory. And he's got no love for bullies." The ride out to Circle H gave Jim time to think. Time to notice how Rose sat easy in the saddle, despite everything. How she pointed out landmarks with the knowledge of a child who'd grown up in this country. Her father had taught her well, taught her to observe, to remember, to survive. The ranch itself was impressive. Clean lines, well-maintained buildings, horses in the corrals that looked healthy and strong. This was a working operation run by someone who understood the land and respected it. Samuel Holloway was breaking a young horse when they rode up. 62 years old, but moving with the ease of a much younger man, speaking softly to the nervous animal, patient and firm. He looked up as they approached, his eyes taking them in with the sharp assessment of someone who'd spent a lifetime reading people. "Help you folks?" "Judge Holloway? Name's Jim Cole. This is Rose Brennan. We need to talk to you about her father." Something shifted in Samuel's expression. He handed the horse's lead to a nearby ranch hand and walked toward them, wiping his hands on his pants. When he looked at Rose, his face softened. "Thomas Brennan's girl. I remember you, child. Your father did some work for me last year. Built doors for my new barn. Finest craftsmanship I ever saw." He paused. "I was sorry to hear about his passing. Sorrier still that I couldn't attend the funeral. I was in Helena on business." "It wasn't an accident," Rose said, her voice steady. "Mr. Brennan and Mr. Hayes killed him. I saw it happen." Most men would have dismissed her, patted her head, made soothing noises about grief and imagination. Samuel Holloway did none of those things. He simply nodded, as if she'd confirmed something he'd already suspected. "Come inside," he said. "This conversation needs coffee and privacy." In the ranch house's kitchen, over cups of strong coffee and fresh bread, Jim laid out everything. Rose's testimony, the suspicious circumstances, the land that stood between Brennan and Hayes's properties, the debt that Thomas had been working to pay off, the sheriff who wouldn't investigate, the reverend who was too frightened to speak. Samuel listened without interrupting, his weathered face giving nothing away. When Jim finished, the old rancher sat back, studying them both. "I believe you," he said finally. "I've known for years that Victor Brennan and Marcus Hayes were snakes. They've run roughshod over this town, crushing anyone who stood against them. But murder?" He shook his head. "That's a line I thought even they wouldn't cross." "Will you help us?" Rose asked. "Please." "Help you how, child? I wasn't there. I have no proof. And much as it pains me to say it, your word alone, even with my support, won't be enough to bring them down." "I need work," Jim said. "Need a reason to stay in Silver Creek long enough to find proof? Or a witness willing to talk?" Samuel studied him for a long moment. "You're running from something." It wasn't a question. Jim met the old man's eyes steadily. "I am, but I'm not running anymore." "What changed?" Jim looked at Rose, at this child who'd waited 21 days on cold steps for a father who would never return. At her courage, her stubborn refusal to let her father's death be forgotten. "She did." Samuel nodded slowly, as if that answered a question he'd been asking himself. "My foreman quit last week, got too old for the work, moved to live with his daughter in Billings. I need someone who knows cattle and horses, someone who can handle the men and handle trouble when it comes. Pays $30 a month, meals included. There's a cabin out back, 2 rooms, needs some fixing, but it's sound. I'll take it. One condition." Samuel's voice went hard. "If you're going after Brennan and Hayes, you do it right. No gunplay unless absolutely necessary. We build a case, find evidence, get testimony. Do it legal and proper, or you'll be no better than they are." Agreed. Rose had been quiet through this exchange, but now she spoke up. "Judge Holloway, do you know who might have sent a letter to the territorial marshal about my father?" Both men turned to stare at her. "What letter?" Jim asked. "Mrs. Wells told me last night. Said someone wrote to Helena 2 weeks ago, told the marshal that my father's death wasn't an accident, that there should be an investigation." Samuel's eyes widened. Then, slowly, he smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. "Well now, that changes things considerably. If the marshal's already investigating, then Brennan and Hayes are on borrowed time. They just don't know it yet." The cabin was small but sturdy, built of logs chinked with clay, with a stone fireplace and 2 rooms separated by a curtain. Rose claimed the smaller room immediately, setting her few possessions on the narrow bed with the careful precision of someone who'd never had space of her own before. Jim spent the afternoon repairing what needed fixing, patching the roof, replacing a broken window pane, clearing mouse nests from the corners. Physical work that let his mind wander, piecing together the puzzle of Thomas Brennan's murder. They needed the Reverend to talk. But how to make a frightened man find courage? They needed to know what Brennan had on him, what leverage kept his tongue still. And they needed to do it before Brennan and Hayes realized the marshal was coming. Rose found him at sunset, sitting on the cabin's small porch, watching the light fade over the distant mountains. She sat beside him without speaking, and for a while they simply existed in comfortable silence. "My pa used to do this," she said eventually. "Sit and watch the sun go down. He said it was the best part of any day." The world getting quiet, getting ready to rest. Her voice caught. "I miss him so much, it hurts." Jim put his arm around her thin shoulders. "I know. It doesn't stop hurting, but it changes, gets different. You learn to carry it instead of it carrying you." "How long did it take? For you?" "Haven't gotten there yet," he admitted. "Been 4 years, and some days it feels fresh as yesterday." "But you stopped running." "Yeah, I stopped running." She leaned against him, warm and solid and real. "I'm glad you stopped here." The next morning brought unexpected visitors. Jim was working in the barn when he heard horses approaching. 3 riders moving fast. He emerged to find Samuel already there, and beside him 2 people Jim hadn't met before. The woman was young, maybe 30, dressed in a traveling suit that had seen hard miles. Her eyes were sharp and intelligent, taking in everything with the quick assessment of someone trained to observe. The man with her was older, wearing a badge that caught the morning sun. "Jim Cole," Samuel said. "This is Deputy Marshal Catherine Reeves and Marshal Thomas Whitmore from Helena. They've come about Thomas Brennan's death." Jim shook their hands, his mind racing. The law had arrived faster than expected. That meant someone in Silver Creek had convinced them this was urgent. Someone with credibility. "Mr. Cole," Marshal Whitmore said, his voice carrying the weight of authority, "we understand you've been asking questions about Thomas Brennan's death. We'd like to hear what you've learned." They gathered in Samuel's house, the marshal and his deputy, Samuel and his wife Martha, Jim and Rose. The girl told her story again, this time to people who listened without dismissing, who asked sharp questions and took careful notes. When she finished, Marshal Whitmore sat back, his expression grave. "That's a serious accusation, Miss Brennan. Murder, against 2 of the most powerful men in Silver Creek." "I know what I saw, sir." "I believe you do. But conviction requires more than one witness, especially when that witness is a child. No offense meant," he added quickly, seeing Rose's face harden. "But that's how the law works. We need corroboration. We need evidence." "Reverend Blackwood saw it too," Rose said. "He was there." "Then we'll speak with him." The marshal stood. "Deputy Reeves and I will conduct interviews in town today. We'll speak to the Reverend, to the sheriff, to anyone who might have information. Mr. Cole, I'd ask that you and Miss Brennan stay here at the ranch. If Brennan and Hayes realize we're investigating, things could get dangerous." But things were already dangerous. That became clear an hour later, when a rider came galloping up to the Circle H, his horse lathered and blowing. One of Samuel's ranch hands, his face pale with shock. "Judge Holloway, there's been a fire in town. The church. It's burning." They saw the smoke from 2 miles away, a black column rising into the blue Montana sky. By the time they reached Silver Creek, half the town was fighting the blaze with bucket brigades and wet blankets, but it was already too late. The old church was fully engulfed, flames eating through the wooden structure with terrifying speed. Jim scanned the crowd, looking for one face in particular. He found Marshal Whitmore standing with Deputy Reeves, both of them watching the fire with grim expressions. "The Reverend?" Jim asked, though he already knew the answer. "Was inside when it started," Whitmore said. "Witnesses say he went in to retrieve church records this morning. Never came out." Rose made a small sound of distress. Jim pulled her close, shielding her eyes from the sight of the burning building. "This wasn't an accident," Deputy Reeves said quietly. "Someone set this fire. And they timed it perfectly, right when we arrived to investigate." "To destroy evidence," Jim said. "Or to silence a witness. Both, most likely." Marshal Whitmore's jaw was tight with anger. This just became a federal investigation. 2 murders now. And whoever is responsible just made their first real mistake. What mistake? They showed they're desperate enough to kill again, desperate enough to burn down a church. That means we're close to something they can't let come to light. As the church collapsed inward in a shower of sparks and ash, Jim saw 2 men watching from across the street. Victor Brennan and Marcus Hayes, standing together, their faces showing nothing but appropriate shock and concern. But their eyes told a different story. Cold eyes, calculating eyes, the eyes of men who'd just eliminated a problem. Rose saw them too. Her small hand gripped Jim's with surprising strength. "They did this," she whispered. "They killed Reverend Blackwood because he saw, because he knew." "Yeah," Jim said. "They did." And in that moment, watching the church burn, watching 2 murderers stand free and unpunished, while a 3rd victim's body turned to ash, Jim felt the old fury return. The cold, dangerous fury that had driven him to hunt down the men who'd killed his family. He'd tried to bury that fury, tried to run from it, tried to tell himself that revenge was a poison that would destroy him. But maybe some poisons were necessary. Maybe some debts had to be paid in blood. Samuel's hand gripped his shoulder, hard and warning. "Legal and proper," the old rancher said quietly. "Remember what you promised. We do this right." Jim nodded, though it cost him. Samuel was right. They had to do this right. Not for Brennan and Hayes, who deserved no mercy, but for Rose. To show her that justice was possible, that the world could be fair, that courage and truth could triumph over power and money. Even if Jim didn't quite believe it himself anymore. That night, back at the cabin, Rose couldn't sleep. Jim found her sitting by the cold fireplace, staring at nothing. "He was going to tell," she said. "Reverend Blackwood. I think he was finally going to tell the truth. And they killed him for it." "Yeah, they did. How many people have to die before someone stops them?" Jim had no answer for that. So instead he sat beside her, and they watched the darkness together, and waited for a dawn that felt very far away. Part 3. The Reckoning. The morning after Eleanor Patterson's visit dawned strange. The sky hung yellow as old bones, pressing down heavy like the world itself was holding its breath. Clara stepped out to feed the chickens and found them huddled in their coop, silent and still. Even the rooster, usually eager to announce his dominion over creation, stayed quiet. The air felt thick enough to drink, and not a whisper of wind moved across the grass. Ethan came out of the barn, stopped, looked at the sky with the kind of attention most men reserve for armed strangers. "Storm coming," he said. "Looks clear," Clara replied. "That's how you know it's bad," he said, and something in his voice made her stomach drop. "We need to prepare." They worked fast without discussion, moving like 2 parts of the same machine. Ethan hauled boards to cover windows, while Clara filled every vessel that could hold water. Buckets, pots, the wash tub, even Sarah's good china cups. They drove the cattle into the near pasture, close enough to watch. Secured the barn doors with extra rope. Checked and double-checked every latch, every board, every possible weakness. "If I say run for the cellar," Ethan told her, his hands full of rope and tools, "you run. Don't grab anything. Don't look back." "What about you?" she asked. "I'll be right behind," he said, but his eyes went to the horizon where something dark was building. "Just promise me you'll run." "I promise," she said, and meant it. The clouds came fast once they started, rolling across the prairie like spilled ink. Black shot through with green, the color of deep bruises, the color of violence waiting to be born. The temperature dropped 20 degrees between one breath and the next. Then the wind hit, not gradual but immediate, a wall of force that nearly knocked Clara sideways. "Cellar!" Ethan shouted. "Now!" They ran. Clara went down the wooden steps first, Ethan right behind her, fighting to hold the cellar door against wind that wanted to rip it from his hands. He got it closed, dropped the bar across, and for a moment they stood in darkness, broken only by the thin light filtering through cracks in the boards overhead. Then he lit the lantern, and yellow light pushed back the shadows. The sound started soft, like distant thunder, then built, and built, and kept building until it wasn't sound anymore, but physical force, vibration that came up through the earth and down through the air and tried to shake them loose from existence itself. Not wind, something alive, something hungry. The house above them screamed as boards tore loose, glass shattered, furniture crashed and tumbled. The tin roof peeled away with a shriek that sounded human. Then the cellar door exploded outward, and the tornado was directly overhead, trying to suck them up into its belly. The pressure dropped so fast, Clara's ears popped. Once, twice, painful as knife stabs. She couldn't breathe right, couldn't hear anything but the roar. Ethan grabbed her, pulled her into the corner, covered her body with his arms locked around her head, his chest pressed against her back, every inch of him a shield between her and the chaos trying to kill them. Dirt rained down from between the floorboards overhead. The lantern guttered and went out. Complete darkness. Just the roar and the pressure, and two bodies pressed together, while the world ended above them. Clara felt Ethan's lips moving against her hair, saying something she couldn't hear over the noise. But she felt the shape of words, felt the desperate press of them against her scalp. If we die, if we die, if we die. She wrapped her arms around his, held on with everything she had. If they were going to die, at least not alone, at least together, at least knowing someone cared, whether they lived or fell. Her hands found his, and laced fingers tight. His heartbeat hammered against her shoulder blade, fast and strong and alive. She turned her head, found his face in the darkness somehow, and pressed her forehead against his jaw. The roar began to move, slowly, so slowly, pulling away like a reluctant beast. The pressure eased. Sound returned, first her own breathing, harsh and quick, then his, then the settling creak of tortured wood. They stayed locked together for another 30 seconds, neither willing to trust that death had passed them by. Then Ethan pulled back, just enough to see her face in the dim light filtering down. "You all right?" he asked, voice rough as gravel. "Yes," she managed. "You?" "Still here," he said. His hands came up to her face, touching, checking for injury or something else, she couldn't tell. They stared at each other in that gray light, both knowing how close they'd come, how thin the margin between breathing and not. The stove stood untouched, a monument to cast-iron stubbornness. But the table was gone. Sarah's china cups still sat on their shelf, filled with rainwater and completely intact. The barn was simply gone. Not damaged, not broken, but erased. In its place, scattered lumber and one confused milk cow standing in the wreckage, lowing pitifully. The chicken coop had been picked up and set down 20 feet away, upside down. From underneath came the outraged squawking of hens who'd survived the impossible. Ethan started to laugh. Not happy laughter, the kind that comes when crying would mean never stopping. Chickens survived, he said. Barn didn't. Lord works in mysterious ways. Clara saw something that made her stomach clench. The lean-to, her room, the corner of the house where she'd slept for 3 weeks. Everything gone except the floor and part of one wall. Her carpet bag had vanished. The yellow dress Ethan gave her disappeared. The bed that had been hers reduced to splinters. But Ethan's room, the room that had been his and Sarah's, stood untouched except for missing windows. The symbolism was so obvious it hurt. "Storm took your room," Ethan said quietly, following her gaze. "Left mine. Along with everything that was mine," Clara said. Her few possessions, her small claim to space, wiped clean. Not that she'd had much, but it had been hers. Ethan looked at her, at the ruins, at his intact room. Then he said something that changed everything. No more separate rooms, no more separate lives. We rebuild together, or not at all. The words hung between them like a bridge. Clara nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat. "Together then," she managed. A horse came thundering across the broken landscape. Sam Patterson, 14 years old, and bleeding from a dozen cuts, his clothes torn to rags. "Mr. Cole," he shouted, pulling his horse up hard. "You got to come. The tornado hit our place dead on. Pa's trapped under the house. Ma sent me to find help." "How bad?" Ethan asked, already moving. "Bad," Sam said. "His legs are pinned. Ma can hear him, but can't reach him." "I'm coming," Clara said. Ethan turned. "Too dangerous. You need every hand," she replied. "And I know some doctoring." He looked at her, really looked, saw something there that made him nod. "Can you ride?" "Fast enough," she said. They caught 2 horses that had survived in the far pasture, spooked but uninjured. Clara hiked her skirts, swung up bareback, gripped the mane. Ethan raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. They rode hard. The landscape they passed through looked like God had taken a knife to creation. Trees stripped naked, fences gone, dead cattle scattered like broken toys. The tornado's path carved through the prairie straight as a railroad track. Everything on one side untouched, everything on the other destroyed. The Patterson place looked like something from Revelation. The house had been lifted, twisted, set down wrong. Walls leaned at angles that hurt to see. The roof sat in the yard like a hat blown off in wind. Eleanor Patterson stood at what used to be the front door, her perfect hair now wild, her riding dress torn. When she saw them, something broke in her face. "Thank the Lord," she said. "He's under here. I can hear him, but—" From under the twisted wood came a sound that made Clara's stomach clench. Not quite scream, not quite moan. The sound pain makes when it's past words. Ethan was already assessing, walking the wreckage, testing boards. "Sam, get every man you can find," he said. "We're going to need leverage. Clara, see what medical supplies survived. Mrs. Patterson, keep talking to him. Let him know we're here." Clara searched the wreckage, found miracles. Carbolic acid unbroken. Clean cloth that used to be curtains. A sewing kit with needles that might serve if it came to that. When she turned back, she saw Ethan had stripped to the waist, his muscles coiled as he and Sam worked to shift a beam. But the main beam, the one holding what remained of the house's weight, that same beam was pinning William Patterson's legs. Move it wrong, and the whole structure would collapse. Move it right, and they might save him. But one wrong calculation, one shifted board, and they'd be pulling out a corpse. "We need to shore up the sides first," Clara heard herself say. "Create a tunnel, then pull him out without shifting the main weight." Ethan stared at her. "You've done this before?" "Saw it once," she said. "Cave in at a mine back home." She didn't add that 3 men had died anyway. Didn't mention the screams. "Show me," Ethan said. And just like that, she was in charge. They worked for 2 hours, Clara directing, men following, building a tunnel of braced posts and boards, inch by careful inch, working toward the trapped man. William Patterson's groans got weaker. Time was running out. Finally, Ethan crawled in, rope tied around his waist. The tunnel held, barely. He reached Patterson, worked to free the trapped legs. Then, "Pull steady," he called. They pulled. Patterson screamed once, sharp and terrible, then went quiet. For a heartbeat, Clara thought they'd lost him. Then Ethan emerged backward, dragging Patterson by the shoulders. The man's legs twisted wrong but free. "He's alive," Ethan said. "But those legs—" Clara was already moving, checking for bleeding, feeling for breaks. Both legs shattered below the knee, but no major blood loss. Yet. "We need the doctor," Eleanor said, her face white as flour. "Doctor's 20 miles away," someone said, "if his place even survived." Clara looked at the angles of Patterson's legs, thought of the 3 miners back home, how 2 died waiting for the doctor, how 1 lived because her mother hadn't waited. "I can set them," she heard herself say. "Not perfect, but enough to give him a chance when the doctor does come." "You?" Eleanor grabbed her arm. "But you're not. You don't." "I've seen it done." Clara met the woman's eyes straight. "I've helped it done. Your choice. Let me try, or wait and hope." Eleanor looked at her husband, unconscious now, his face gray as ash. "Do it," she said. Clara had Ethan cut splints from lumber while she mixed carbolic acid with water. Sam held Patterson's shoulders. 4 men held his hips. Ethan positioned himself at Clara's direction, ready to pull the bones straight while she guided them. "On 3, she said. 1, 2. On 3, she nodded to Ethan. He pulled steady while she felt the bones through skin, guiding them back to where they belonged. Patterson woke screaming. Eleanor sobbed, but Clara's hands stayed steady. The left leg went back together like the Lord intended. The right fought her, bones grinding. She had to break it again to set it right. That's when Patterson passed out for good, which was mercy. When both legs were splinted and wrapped, Clara sat back on her heels. Blood covered her hands, her dress. The sun was setting, painting everything the color of the morning's storm clouds. "Will he live?" Eleanor asked. "Maybe," Clara said honestly. "If infection doesn't set in. If the bones heal straight. If." Eleanor grabbed Clara's bloody hands. "I was wrong," she said through tears. "What I said before. What I thought. You're exactly who we needed. Who Ethan needed." Clara pulled her hands free, uncomfortable with gratitude. "Anyone would have," she started. "No," Ethan said quiet. "They wouldn't." They rode home in the last light, horses picking through debris. Neither spoke. Too much had changed in one day. The storm, the rescue, the way they'd worked together like two hands of the same body. The ranch looked worse in sunset. Shadows made the damage deeper. The roofless kitchen gaped at the sky. But the chickens were alive, complaining about their overturned coop. The milk cow stood patient by the ruined barn, needing milked. Life demanding attention, despite destruction. "We'll sleep in my room," Ethan said. "Only space left with 4 walls." Clara nodded. No energy left for propriety. They were past that now, past the careful distances of their first weeks. They worked by lantern light, salvaging what they could. She made coffee, fried eggs, toasted bread on the stove. Simple food that tasted like survival. "You did good today," Ethan said over the meal. "With Patterson. With everything." "Learned from my mother," Clara replied, before she decided I was dead to her. "Her loss," he said firmly. They cleaned up in silence, then faced the reality. 1 room, 1 bed, 2 people who'd started as strangers and become something else in the space of a storm. "I'll take the floor," Ethan started. "No," Clara surprised herself with the firmness. "We're both exhausted. We're both adults. We can share a bed without it meaning more than shelter." He looked at her long, then nodded. They prepared for bed, careful. Her behind the privacy screen Sarah had painted with flowers. Him turned to the wall. When they finally lay down, the mattress dipped toward the middle, gravity pulling them closer than intended. Clara lay rigid, aware of every sound he made, every breath, every shift. Then she felt his hand find hers in the darkness between them. His fingers laced through hers, rough calluses against her work-worn palm. "We're going to be all right," he said into the dark. "You and me. We're going to rebuild, and it's going to be different, better, how we want it, together." "Together," she agreed, squeezing his hand. They fell asleep like that, fingers linked, 2 people choosing each other in the ruins of everything they'd lost. When morning came, it would bring work, rebuilding, facing the town's questions. But for now, in the darkness of their damaged house, they had this: the choice to be together. Not because they had to, not because circumstances forced it, but because somewhere between that depot platform and this moment, 2 broken people had discovered something neither expected. Not the grand passion Sarah had written about. Something quieter. Something stronger. Partnership built on respect and honesty, and the simple courage to stand together when the world tried to knock them down. 3 months later, Sam Patterson would marry Margaret in a ceremony held in the Pattersons' rebuilt barn. William Patterson would walk his daughter down the aisle on a cane, his legs healed crooked, but healed. Eleanor Patterson would publicly thank Clara Cole for saving her husband's life, and the town would finally, grudgingly, accept the woman nobody had wanted. 6 months after that, Ethan and Clara would stand before the preacher in their own rebuilt house, making official what had been true since that day in the cellar. Their vows would be simple. "I choose you. I choose you too." And they would mean it with every breath in their bodies. The ranch would never be what Sarah had dreamed. No wallpaper from St. Louis, no parlor with French curtains. But it would be solid, practical, built for work and survival, and 2 people who understood that real love isn't about poetry and roses. It's about standing together in the storm. It's about choosing each other, day after day, when choosing would be easier than staying. It's about building something honest from the wreckage of pretty lies. And Clara Bennett Cole, the woman nobody wanted at that depot in September of 1882, would become the woman everybody needed. She'd teach field medicine to ranch wives. She'd deliver babies and set bones and tend the sick. She'd never have children of her own, but she'd help raise half the young ones in 3 counties. And she'd do it all with Ethan beside her, quiet and steady as bedrock, the cowboy who'd chosen her when the whole world turned its back. Years later, when Sam Patterson was an old man himself, he'd sit on his porch and tell this story to anyone who'd listen. About the day a tornado took everything, but gave back more. About a woman who stood tall when others would have broken. About a man who learned that the strongest choice he ever made was choosing to love again, despite the cost. About 2 people who proved that sometimes the best love stories don't start with perfection. They start with 2 damaged souls deciding to build something beautiful from the ruins. And that, Sam would say as the sun set over the prairie, that's worth remembering. That's worth telling. That's the kind of story that matters. The kind where broken people don't stay broken. Where being unwanted becomes the first step toward being truly seen. Where a cowboy and a cast-off woman build something stronger than either could have managed alone. Where love isn't about saving each other, but about choosing to stand side by side while you both save yourselves. That's the story of Ethan and Clara Cole. That's the story of The Last Choice. And it's a story that deserves to be told as long as there's breath to tell it and ears to hear. Winter came early to Montana that year, sweeping down from the mountains with a cold that cut through wool and leather like it was nothing. But inside the small cabin at Circle H Ranch, a fire burned warm, and Rose Cole sat at the kitchen table doing her arithmetic while Jim mended tack by lamplight. 6 months had passed since the trial. 6 months of building something that felt fragile and precious, and more real than anything Jim had known in years. He'd stopped looking over his shoulder, stopped planning escape routes from every room he entered, stopped living like a man with 1 foot always out the door. But peace, he was learning, had its own complications. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, brought by a rider from Helena. Official territorial seal, addressed to James Cole in a hand Jim didn't recognize. He opened it while Rose was at her lessons with Martha Holloway, not wanting to worry the girl until he knew what it contained. The words on the page made his blood run cold. Mr. Cole, my name is William Grant. I represent the estate of Margaret Brennan, Thomas Brennan's late mother. It has come to our attention that you have taken guardianship of Miss Rose Brennan without proper legal authority. Mrs. Margaret Brennan, prior to her death, designated me as executor, with specific instructions regarding any surviving grandchildren. As Rose's blood relative through marriage, I am hereby claiming legal custody. Court hearing scheduled February 15th, Helena. Failure to appear will result in immediate custody transfer. Jim read the letter 3 times, each reading making the trap more clear. Margaret Brennan had been dead for 15 years. Rose had never mentioned any grandmother, any extended family. This Grant was a liar, a fraud, someone hired by someone with money and motivation, someone who wanted Rose's land. Samuel confirmed Jim's suspicions within the hour. Victor Brennan had a cousin. Marcus Hayes had business partners in Denver, men with money and long memories. The old rancher's face was grim. They're coming at Rose through legal channels this time. Learn from their cousin's mistakes. Can they win? In court? With the right judge? The right arguments? Samuel shook his head. Maybe. You're not blood family. Your adoption papers are recent. A good lawyer could argue you manipulated a traumatized child, moved too fast, didn't follow proper procedures. So what do? We fight. We get the best lawyer in the territory. We show the court that Rose is thriving, that you're a fit guardian, that this Grant is exactly what we know he is. a fraud. But fighting meant going to Helena, meant leaving the safety of Circle H and the protection of Marshal Whitmore, meant putting Rose in danger again, just when she'd started to feel safe. That night, Jim told her about the letter. He'd thought about hiding it, handling it himself, but Rose deserved the truth. She'd earned that right through everything she'd survived. She took it better than he'd expected, sat quietly while he explained, her face serious but not frightened. When he finished, she asked only one question. "Do you want to keep me?" The question hit Jim like a physical blow. "Rose, of course I want to keep you. You're my daughter now. Nothing's going to change that." "Then we fight." She said it with the same certainty she'd had when identifying her father's killers. "We go to Helena. We tell the truth. We win." If only it were that simple. They left for Helena a week before the hearing. Jim and Rose and Samuel, and the best lawyer Samuel's money could hire. A woman named Elizabeth Blackwell, sharp-eyed and sharper-tongued, who'd built a reputation defending the defenseless against powerful men who thought money made them untouchable. "I've looked into this William Grant," she told them on the journey. "He exists, that much is true. He was a lawyer in Denver until 18 months ago, when he was disbarred for falsifying documents. Since then, he's worked as a legal consultant for various business interests. Translation: he's a hired gun who'll say anything for the right price. Can you prove that in court? I can raise reasonable doubt, can show his history of fraud, but judges are unpredictable, especially in custody cases. They tend to favor blood relations over recent guardians, even fraudulent blood relations, if the fraud isn't absolutely proven." She looked at Rose with something like admiration. "It's going to come down to you, child. What you say, what you want. If you can convince the judge that Jim is the father you've chosen, that might be enough." The weight of it settled on Rose's small shoulders, but she didn't flinch. "I can do it." Helena in February was a city locked in ice, the buildings gray and stern, the people bundled against cold that felt meaner than it did in the open country. They took rooms at the Grand View Hotel, 3 rooms on the 2nd floor, and spent the days before the hearing preparing. Elizabeth coached Rose on what to expect, how to address the judge, how to answer questions clearly, how to stay calm even when the opposing lawyer tried to rattle her. "They'll try to make you seem unstable," Elizabeth warned. "They'll bring up the 21 days you spent on those steps. They'll suggest you're traumatized, incapable of making sound decisions, that you latched onto the first adult who showed you kindness. But that's not true. We know that. But truth and legal argument aren't always the same thing." Elizabeth's expression softened. "You need to be strong, Rose. Stronger than any child should have to be. Can you do that?" Rose looked at Jim, at this man who'd stopped when everyone else had walked past, who'd believed her when no one else would, who'd chosen to stay when staying was hard. "Yes," she said, "I can do that." The courtroom was smaller than Jim had imagined, paneled in dark wood that absorbed light and gave the space a somber, church-like quality. Judge Harold Morrison presided, a man in his 60s with white hair and eyes that revealed nothing. William Grant sat at the opposing table, well-dressed and confident, with a lawyer beside him who looked expensive. They'd clearly come prepared for battle. The hearing began with Grant's lawyer laying out his case. Margaret Brennan's will, he claimed, had specific provisions for any grandchildren. Documentary evidence showed Thomas Brennan was her son, therefore Rose was her granddaughter. Therefore, William Grant, as executor, had both legal authority and familial obligation to assume guardianship. "And what," Judge Morrison asked, "is your relationship to the deceased, to Margaret Brennan?" "I served as her attorney for the last 3 years of her life, Your Honor. She trusted me. Named me executor because she had no other living family save her son Thomas, who she was estranged from." Estranged. The word hung in the air. If Thomas had been estranged from his mother, it suggested family dysfunction. Suggested, perhaps, that Thomas wouldn't have wanted his mother's lawyer raising his daughter. Elizabeth Blackwell stood, and her voice carried the cool precision of a surgeon's scalpel. "Mr. Grant claims to have served Mrs. Brennan as her attorney, yet he was disbarred 18 months ago for document forgery in the state of Colorado. Could the witness explain how he continued to practice law after losing his license?" Grant's face flushed. "I was never disbarred. That was a misunderstanding, later resolved. Yet the Colorado Bar Association has no record of your reinstatement." Elizabeth produced documents. "In fact, they have explicit record of your permanent removal from practice. So I'll ask again, how could you have served as Mrs. Brennan's attorney if you weren't legally permitted to practice law?" "I served as her legal consultant. Without disclosing your disbarment? Isn't that fraud, Mr. Grant?" The questioning went on, Elizabeth methodically dismantling Grant's credibility, exposing contradictions, raising doubts. But Grant's lawyer fought back, pointing to technicalities, to the letter of the law that favored family connections, however distant, over recent guardians, however well-meaning. Then it was Rose's turn to testify. She walked to the witness stand with her head high, wearing a blue dress Martha had made for her, her red hair braided neatly. She looked small in the chair, her feet not quite touching the floor, but her voice when she spoke was steady. Elizabeth questioned her first. Gentle questions about her life with Jim, about how he'd found her on those steps, about how he'd believed her story when no one else would, about how he'd fought for justice for her father, about their quiet life at Circle H, about school and horses and learning carpentry. "Do you love Mr. Cole?" Elizabeth asked. "Yes, ma'am. He's my father now." "Not your guardian? Your father?" "My father." Rose's voice was firm. "Pa was my father too, and I'll never forget him. But Jim is the father I have now, the one who chose me, the one I choose." Then Grant's lawyer stood for cross-examination, and the tone changed immediately. His questions were designed to unsettle, to make Rose seem disturbed and unreliable. "Miss Brennan, isn't it true that you spent 3 weeks sitting alone on store steps, refusing to accept your father's death?" "I was waiting, like Pa taught me to." "Waiting for a dead man? Doesn't that suggest an unstable mind?" "Objection." Elizabeth was on her feet. "Counsel is badgering the witness." Sustained. Judge Morrison looked at Grant's lawyer with disapproval. "Rephrase your question, counselor." But the damage was attempted. The lawyer pressed on, trying to paint Rose as traumatized, as latching on to Jim out of desperation rather than genuine connection, as unable to make sound decisions about her own future. Rose held firm, answered each question with clarity, never wavered, never broke. And slowly, Jim could see the judge's expression changing, could see Morrison beginning to understand what he was looking at. Not a traumatized child, but a remarkably strong young woman who knew exactly what she wanted. Finally, Judge Morrison raised his hand. "Enough. I've heard sufficient testimony." He looked at Rose with something approaching respect. "Miss Brennan, I'm going to ask you a question, and I want you to answer honestly. Not what you think I want to hear, not what your guardians want you to say. The truth. Yes, sir. If I rule in Mr. Grant's favor, award him custody, you would be removed from Mr. Cole's care and placed with Mr. Grant in Denver. If I rule against him, you remain with Mr. Cole at Circle H Ranch. Understanding both options, where do you want to be? Rose didn't hesitate. With Jim, with my father, that's my home now. And if Mr. Grant can prove a blood relationship, prove he has legal standing, then I'd run away. The words came quiet but absolute. I'd run away and find my way back to Jim, because that's my family. Not because of blood or law, but because of choice. Because he chose me and I chose him, and that's what makes a family real. Silence filled the courtroom. Judge Morrison sat back, studying Rose for a long moment. Then he looked at Jim, at Samuel, at William Grant and his expensive lawyer. I'll render my decision tomorrow morning. This hearing is adjourned. That night, Jim couldn't sleep. He paced their hotel room while Rose slept soundly in the next room, exhausted by the ordeal. Samuel found him at midnight, standing at the window, looking out at Helena's frozen streets. She did well today, Samuel said. She did better than well. She was incredible. Jim's voice was rough. But will it be enough? Morrison's a fair judge. He saw through Grant, saw Rose's strength. But fair doesn't always win. You said so yourself. Jim turned from the window. If he rules against us, if they try to take her, I won't let them. I'll take Rose and we'll disappear. Mexico, Canada, somewhere they can't find us. That would make you a fugitive, make her a kidnapped child in the eyes of the law. I don't care. I won't lose another daughter. Samuel gripped Jim's shoulder. You won't have to. Have faith. But faith was hard when you'd already lost everything once. Hard when you knew how easily the world could take away what you loved most. Morning came cold and clear. They assembled in the courtroom at 9, everyone taking their places for Judge Morrison's ruling. The judge entered precisely on time, and his face revealed nothing. I've considered all testimony and evidence presented, he began. This case comes down to a fundamental question. What constitutes family? Is it blood? Is it law? Or is it something deeper? Jim's heart pounded so hard he could barely hear the judge's words. Mr. Grant claims a legal right based on a questionable will and an alleged relationship to the deceased. But his credibility is severely compromised by his history of fraud and document falsification. Moreover, he has shown no genuine care for Miss Brennan's well-being, only for control of her property. Grant's face darkened, but he said nothing. Mr. Cole, on the other hand, has demonstrated consistent care, protection, and genuine love for this child. He stopped when others walked past. He believed her when others dismissed her. He fought for her when others would have given up. And, most importantly, he chose her, not for her property, but for herself. Morrison looked directly at Rose. And she chose him. Clearly, firmly, without hesitation. That choice matters. The judge picked up his gavel. Therefore, I rule in favor of James Cole. Custody of Rose Brennan, now legally Rose Cole, remains with her adoptive father. Mr. Grant's petition is denied. Furthermore, I'm ordering an investigation into the will he claims gives him authority. If it's found to be fraudulent, Mr. Grant will face criminal charges. The gavel fell with a sound like thunder. For a moment, Jim couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then Rose was there, throwing her arms around him, and he held her close while Elizabeth shook his hand and Samuel clapped his shoulder, and William Grant stormed from the courtroom in defeat. They'd won. Against the odds, against men with money and power and legal machinations, they'd won. And with custody secured, so was Rose's inheritance. The 5 acres that had cost Thomas Brennan his life would remain in her hands, proof that sometimes justice prevailed. Because a brave girl had told the truth, and a good judge had listened. The journey back to Circle H took 3 days through winter cold, but Jim barely felt it. Rose rode beside him, chattering about everything and nothing, making plans for spring planting and summer riding, and all the tomorrows they now had guaranteed. "Jim?" she asked on the last night, as they made camp under stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. "Yeah, little one? Thank you for not giving up, for fighting for me." "Always," he said, "always." And he meant it. Whatever challenges came, whatever threats emerged, he would face them. Not alone, not running, but standing firm with his daughter beside him. Because he'd finally learned what Thomas Brennan had known, what Rose had tried to teach him from the start. Home wasn't a place you ran to. Home wasn't safety from the world. Home was people you chose to stand with, even when standing was hard. Home was promises kept. Home was showing up. Home was love made real through action and choice, and the simple daily decision to stay. They rode into Circle H 3 days later, and Martha had hot food waiting. The ranch hands welcomed them back with genuine warmth. Even the horses seemed glad to see them, nickering greetings as Thunder and Rose's mare Hope found their familiar stalls. That night, sitting on their cabin porch despite the cold, wrapped in blankets with hot cider warming their hands, Jim and Rose watched stars wheel overhead in their ancient patterns. They didn't speak, didn't need to. The silence between them was comfortable, full, complete. A man who'd spent 4 years running had finally stopped. A girl who'd waited 21 days had finally been found. And together, they'd built something worth keeping, worth fighting for, worth everything. The last promise had been kept, and all the tomorrows stretched ahead, bright with possibility and hope. Home. At last, home. Spring came late to Montana that year, but when it finally arrived, it came with a fury of color that made the long winter seem worth enduring. Wildflowers carpeted the hillsides. The creek that gave Silver Creek its name ran high and clear with snowmelt. And in the small cabin at Circle H Ranch, Rose Cole turned 9 years old. Martha Holloway baked a cake, 3 layers high, with frosting that Rose declared was the best thing she'd ever tasted. The ranch hands pooled their money to buy her a new saddle, hand-tooled leather that smelled of promise and adventure. Samuel gave her a book of poetry that had belonged to his own daughter, dead these 20 years, but not forgotten. And Jim gave her something he'd been working on in secret for months. A wooden box, handcrafted from cherry wood, with her initials carved into the lid, and a lock that only she would have the key to. Inside, he'd placed 2 items. A photograph of Thomas Brennan that Mrs. Wells had found in her attic, and a letter Jim had written, but never sent, addressed to Annie, telling his lost daughter about the new daughter he'd found. Rose opened the box with trembling hands, saw what it contained, and understood immediately what Jim was giving her. Permission to remember. Permission to love both fathers, both families, both lives. Permission to be whole instead of choosing between past and present. She cried then, not from sadness, but from a relief so profound it had to escape somehow. and Jim held her while she wept. This girl who'd been so strong for so long, finally able to be fragile because she knew she was safe. "Thank you," she whispered, when the tears finally stopped, "for understanding, for not making me choose." "You never have to choose, Rose. Love doesn't work that way. There's always enough." It was a good day, a perfect day, the kind of day that made Jim believe, really believe, that the worst was behind them, that they'd fought their battles and won their peace and could finally just live. He should have known better. Peace, in Jim's experience, was always temporary. The rider arrived 3 days after Rose's birthday, coming in hard and fast from the direction of town. Jim was working with a young stallion in the corral when he heard the hoofbeats, looked up to see a boy of maybe 15 sliding from his lathered horse. "Mr. Cole, Judge Holloway needs you at the house, now." Jim found Samuel in his study, face grave, holding a telegram. Martha stood beside him, her hand on his shoulder, her expression tight with worry. "What's happened?" Samuel handed him the telegram without speaking. Jim read it once, twice, the words refusing to make sense, even as their meaning became terribly clear. "Marshal Whitmore, murdered. Stop. Deputy Reeves, critically wounded. Stop. Suspects believed headed your direction. Stop. Take precautions. Stop. Federal marshals dispatched. Stop. ETA 3 days. Stop." "When?" Jim's voice came out flat, dead. "Telegrams from yesterday evening. Happened in Helena 2 days ago." Samuel's jaw was tight. Whitmore was investigating connections between Victor Brennan's remaining associates and certain territorial officials. Someone didn't want that investigation to continue. "And they think these someones are coming here?" Whitmore's files were taken. Files that detailed everything about Thomas Brennan's murder, about Rose's testimony, about the Circle H's involvement. Samuel met Jim's eyes. "They know we were the ones who brought their operation down. They know Rose is here." Jim felt the old, familiar coldness settle into his bones. The coldness that had sustained him through 4 years of hunting. The coldness that had made him dangerous. How many? Unknown. But if they were bold enough to kill a federal marshal in Helena, they won't hesitate to attack a ranch in the middle of nowhere. Then we prepare. Jim's mind was already working, cataloging defenses, calculating odds. We have 3 days, maybe less if they ride hard. We use that time to fortify, to arm everyone who can shoot, to send the women and children somewhere safe. The women stay. Martha's voice was steel. "This is my home, too. I know how to shoot, and I won't run from men who think murder solves problems." Rose appeared in the doorway, still wearing her birthday dress. "What's wrong?" Jim wanted to lie, to protect her from this, but she deserved truth, had always deserved truth. "Bad men are coming. Men who worked with the people who killed your pa. Men who don't want us telling what we know. So we fight them." She said it matter-of-factly, as if there were no other option worth considering. "You don't fight anyone. You're 9 years old." "I'm 9 years old, and I've survived things grown men couldn't handle." Her brown eyes were fierce. "You don't get to protect me by leaving me helpless. If they're coming, I need to know how to defend myself." Samuel spoke before Jim could argue. "She's right. Better she knows how to use a rifle than dies not knowing. This isn't the world we want for children, but it's the world we've got." So Jim taught her. Spent the next 2 days teaching Rose how to hold a rifle, how to sight down the barrel, how to squeeze the trigger instead of pulling. She learned fast, as she learned everything, with fierce concentration and stubborn determination. But more than shooting, he taught her about cover and concealment, about when to fight and when to hide, about survival not as cowardice, but as wisdom, about living to fight another day. "If it comes to it," he told her on the second night, "you run. You take thunder, and you ride for town, and you don't look back. No matter what. No matter what you hear or see, you survive. Promise me." "I promise to do what's smart. That's all I can promise." It would have to be enough. The attack came on the third morning, just as dawn was breaking. Jim was on watch, sitting on the roof of the barn with a rifle across his knees, when he saw them. 6 riders coming fast from the east, spread out in a line, moving with military precision. His shout woke the ranch. Within seconds, Samuel's carefully laid plans activated. Ranch hands to defensive positions. Martha and 2 other women into the house with ammunition. Rose to the root cellar with instructions to stay there unless the house itself caught fire. Jim took position on the barn roof. Best vantage point, best field of fire. From here he could cover the main approach, could protect the house where Rose sheltered. The riders stopped just outside rifle range. One of them, a big man on a black horse, called out, "James Cole, we know you're in there. We don't want trouble. Just give us the girl and we'll ride out peaceful." "Like hell you will," Samuel's voice rang from the house. "You murdered a federal marshal. You're not taking anyone anywhere. Old man, you're interfering in business that doesn't concern you. This is between us and Cole. It concerns me when murderers come to my land." Samuel fired a shot over their heads. Warning, not attempt to kill. "And you're not welcome here. Ride out now or face consequences." The big man laughed. "Consequences? We're 6 guns against what? A handful of ranch hands and an old man? Those are odds I like." "Then you're stupider than you look." This voice was new, coming from the tree line to the north. Jim's heart leapt as he recognized it. Deputy Catherine Reeves, alive despite the telegram's claim, emerging from cover with a rifle trained on the riders. "Federal Deputy Marshal, you're all under arrest for the murder of Marshal Thomas Whitmore." The riders spun their horses, suddenly finding themselves caught between 2 firing positions. The big man's hand moved toward his gun. "Don't!" Reeves' voice cracked like a whip. "I'm authorized to use deadly force. Drop your weapons or die where you sit." For a moment, everything hung in balance. 6 men against an unknown number of defenders, caught in a crossfire, weighing odds and outcomes. Jim could see the calculation in their eyes, the moment of decision. Then one of them, younger and more nervous than the others, broke, drew his gun in panic. And everything went to hell. The firefight lasted less than 3 minutes, but felt eternal. Jim fired with mechanical precision, dropping the young fool who'd drawn first, then shifting targets. Samuel and his men fired from the house. Reeves fired from the trees. The attackers, caught in the open, tried to scatter, tried to find cover that didn't exist. 4 of them died in the first minute. The 5th took a bullet in the shoulder and threw down his gun, screaming surrender. The 6th, the big man on the black horse, spurred toward the house, toward where Rose hid. Jim didn't think, didn't aim, just reacted. His bullet took the rider high in the back, pitching him from his horse to sprawl motionless in the dirt. Silence fell like a physical weight. Gunsmoke drifted across the yard. The riderless horses stood confused, unsure whether to run or stay. And 6 men lay dead or dying, their threat ended, their mission failed. Jim was climbing down from the barn when Rose burst from the root cellar. She ran across the yard, heedless of danger, straight to Jim, and he caught her up, holding her tight. "I heard shooting. So much shooting. I thought—" Her voice broke. "I'm okay. We're all okay." He buried his face in her hair, breathing in the scent of her, grateful beyond words that he could still hold her. It's over. They're gone. Deputy Reeves approached, favoring her left side where blood seeped through her shirt. The telegram had been right about her being wounded, but wrong about how critically. I came as soon as I could travel. Knew they'd come here. Knew you'd need help. You saved us. We saved each other. She looked at the bodies, her face hard. These men were hired by the same network that employed Brennan and Hayes. Territorial corruption runs deep. Whitmore found evidence of bribes, of fixed trials, of murders covered up. He was going to expose all of it. And they killed him for it. They did. But his evidence survived. I have it hidden safely. With this, she gestured of the dead men, we now have proof of conspiracy to commit murder. The territorial governor is already moving to clean house. Judges, sheriffs, officials, anyone connected to the corruption. It's over. Really over this time. Jim wanted to believe her, wanted to think that this was truly the end, that no more threats would emerge from shadows to endanger the fragile peace they'd built. But he'd learned that hope was dangerous, that safety was always temporary. As if reading his thoughts, Rose spoke. It's never really over, is it? There's always going to be bad men. Always going to be danger. Maybe, Jim admitted. But there's also always going to be people willing to stand against them. People like Marshal Whitmore, like Deputy Reeves, like your father, who stood up to Brennan and Hayes, even knowing what it might cost. Like you. Like us. He set her down, kept one hand on her shoulder. Like all of us who choose to fight instead of looking away. The federal marshals arrived that afternoon, along with a territorial judge and enough documentation to make it clear that Jim and Samuel had acted in lawful defense of their property. The wounded attacker, desperate to avoid hanging, confirmed everything. Named names, detailed operations, exposed the full scope of the conspiracy that had corrupted Silver Creek and a dozen other towns. Over the following weeks, arrests were made across Montana territory. Corrupt officials were removed from office. Ill-gotten land was restored to rightful owners. And slowly, painfully, a form of justice emerged from the violence and chaos. But justice, Jim was learning, wasn't the same as healing. That took longer, took time and patience, and the daily choice to keep living, despite what you'd seen and done. Summer came in full glory, and with it came a letter from Kansas, from a woman named Helen Mitchell, who'd been Sarah's best friend before the fire. The letter was brief, written in careful script, and it said things Jim needed to hear, but hadn't known he needed. Sarah had known about the danger, had known the Keller brothers were coming. But instead of running, instead of taking Annie and fleeing while Jim was in town, she'd stayed. Had tried to fight the fire herself, had died not because Jim failed to save her, but because she'd chosen to fight rather than abandon their home. She was brave, the letter said, so incredibly brave. And she'd want you to know, it wasn't your fault. It was never your fault. She loved you until her last breath, and she'd want you to live, really live, find joy again, find peace. Jim read the letter 3 times, sitting alone on the cabin porch while Rose was at lessons with Martha. Read it and felt something inside him that had been clenched tight for 4 years finally begin to loosen. Not your fault. Simple words. Words he'd heard before from well-meaning people, but coming from someone who'd known Sarah, who'd been there in those final weeks, they carried weight, carried truth. He couldn't save Sarah, couldn't reach Annie through the flames, But he had saved Rose, had given her justice and safety and a future. And maybe that was enough. Maybe that was what Sarah would have wanted. Not for him to die inside from guilt and grief, but to live, to love again, to be a father again. That evening, he and Rose walked to the creek together. Summer heat had gentled it from spring's fury to a peaceful flow, clear enough to see stones on the bottom. They sat on the bank, dangling bare feet in cold water, watching fish dart between shadows. "Are you happy?" Rose asked suddenly. Jim considered the question seriously. Happy was a big word, a complicated word. He'd been in love with grief so long that happiness felt foreign, like a language he'd forgotten how to speak. But sitting here with his daughter, on land they'd fought for, in a peace they'd earned through courage and stubbornness and refusing to give up, was he happy? "Yeah," he said slowly. "Yeah, I think I am." "Good." Rose kicked her feet, sending up spray that caught the sunlight. "Because I am too. And I wanted to make sure you knew that. That all of this, everything we've been through, it was worth it. Because we're here now, together." It was worth it, Jim agreed. Every bit of it. They sat in comfortable silence, father and daughter, watching the creek flow past. And Jim thought about promises. About the promise he'd made to himself that day on the store steps. About the promise he'd made to Rose to never leave her. About the promise he'd made to Rachel's memory to live, really live, instead of just surviving. All those promises kept, all those debts paid, all that pain not erased but transformed into something bearable, something almost beautiful. The sun moved toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Somewhere a bird sang. The creek whispered its endless song. And in that moment, Jim Cole finally understood what it meant to be home. Not a place, not safety from the world, but this, sitting beside someone you loved, watching water flow past, knowing that tomorrow would come and you'd face it together. Knowing that whatever challenges emerged, whatever dangers threatened, you wouldn't face them alone. "Rose?" "Yeah?" "Thank you." "For what?" "For being stubborn enough to wait. For being brave enough to trust me. For teaching me that running doesn't solve anything." She leaned against his shoulder, warm and solid and real. "You taught me some things too. Like how strength isn't about not being scared. It's about being scared and doing what's right anyway. Your pa taught you that. I just reminded you. Maybe, but you showed me it was true." She paused. "Can I tell you something?" "Always." "Sometimes I still miss Pa so much it hurts. I dream about him, and when I wake up, I forget he's gone, just for a second. But then I remember, and it feels like losing him all over again." Jim's throat tightened. "I know. I still do that with Rachel and Annie." "Does it ever stop?" "The missing? No, but it changes. Becomes part of you instead of all of you. You learn to carry it." He squeezed her shoulder gently. "And the best part is, loving me doesn't mean not loving him. You get to keep both. Always. That's what the box you gave me means, isn't it? That I don't have to choose." "That's exactly what it means." The sun touched the horizon, and the world turned gold. In the distance they could hear Martha calling them for supper. The mundane, beautiful sound of normal life, of family, of home. They walked back together as darkness fell, and somewhere above them, stars were beginning to emerge. The same stars that had watched over a girl waiting 21 days on cold steps. The same stars that had guided a man running for 4 years from grief and guilt. The same stars that had witnessed murder and justice, loss and finding, death and new life. The stars that would keep watching as Jim Cole and Rose Cole built their future, one day at a time, one choice at a time, one kept promise at a time. The girl who'd waited had been found. The man who'd run had stopped running. And together, they'd discovered that home wasn't where you came from or where you were going. Home was the choice to stay, the choice to fight, the choice to love, even when love meant risking loss all over again. It was the hardest choice, the bravest choice, the only choice that mattered. And they'd made it, together, forever. The last promise had been kept, and all the tomorrows stretched ahead, bright with possibility, heavy with hope, rich with the simple, profound gift of being alive and being loved and being home. In Silver Creek, Montana, in the summer of 1880, a man and a girl walked toward a lighted cabin, and in that moment, they were enough. More than enough. They were everything. The story of how they found each other would be told for generations, would become legend, would inspire others who waited or ran or despaired to keep going, keep hoping, keep believing that sometimes, just sometimes, the right person stops at exactly the right time and everything changes. But for Jim and Rose, it was simpler than legend. It was just life, hard and beautiful and worth every moment, worth every fight, worth everything. They reached the cabin and went inside together, and the door closed behind them, shutting out the darkness, welcoming them home. Home at last. Home forever. 5 years passed like water flowing over stones, shaping everything they touched, but so gradually you barely noticed the change until you looked back and saw how different the landscape had become. Rose was 14 now, tall and strong, her red hair catching fire in the Montana sun as she worked alongside Jim in the workshop he'd built behind their cabin. The cabin itself had grown, 2 rooms becoming 4, rough logs giving way to finished walls, a temporary shelter transformed into a permanent home. She was learning carpentry the way her father Thomas had once practiced it, with reverence for the wood and patience for the process. Her hands, once small and uncertain, now moved with confidence as she planed a board smooth, checking the grain, feeling for imperfections. Jim watched her work with pride so profound it sometimes stole his breath. This girl who'd waited 21 days on cold steps had become a young woman who knew how to build things that lasted, who understood that strength came not from never falling, but from getting up every time you did. "You're staring again," Rose said, without looking up from her work. "Just thinking." "About what?" "About how you've grown. About how fast time moves." He paused. "About how I almost kept writing that day. Almost didn't stop." Rose set down her plane and looked at him directly. "But you did stop. That's what matters. Not what you almost did, what you actually did." She was right, of course. She usually was. But Jim couldn't help thinking about all the moments that had led to this one. All the choices made and not made. All the roads taken and not taken. How fragile it had all been. How easily it could have gone differently. The afternoon mail brought a letter that would test everything they'd built. Jim recognized the handwriting before he saw the return address. Samuel Holloway's careful script, but shakier than usual. Older. Jim, I'm writing this from my bed, which is where the doctor says I'll be spending most of my remaining time. The heart, he tells me, is finally giving out. I've had 83 years, which is more than many get, so I'm not complaining. But there are things I need to say before I run out of time to say them. The Circle H Ranch has been my life's work. Built it from nothing, watched it grow, took pride in every acre and every animal. When my daughter died, and Martha and I never had more children, I thought the ranch would die with me. Thought everything I'd built would be sold off to strangers who'd never understand what it meant. But then you came. You and Rose. And I've watched you these 5 years. Watched you work the land with respect. Watched you treat the animals with care. Watched you build something that matters. And I've made a decision. The ranch is yours. All of it. The land, the cattle, the horses, everything. My lawyers have drawn up the papers. When I'm gone, which won't be long now, Circle H becomes the Cole Ranch. On one condition, that you keep it working, keep it alive, pass it on to Rose someday, and have her pass it on to her children, and let it be what it's always been, a place where honest work is respected, and good people can build good lives. I know this is a lot to ask. Ranching is hard. The weather doesn't care about your plans. The market doesn't care about your needs. But I've seen how you handle hard things, how you face them instead of running. And I trust you with my legacy in a way I've never trusted anyone else. Come see me soon. Martha says I'm being morbid, but I'm being realistic. I'd like to see you and Rose before I go. There are things I want to say in person. Your friend, Samuel. Jim read the letter twice, then handed it to Rose without speaking. She read it slowly, her expression shifting from surprise to sadness to something that looked like determination. We should go now, she said. Today. If he's asking us to come, he doesn't have much time. They rode to the main house in silence, both lost in thought. Samuel had been more than an employer, more than a friend. He'd been the first person besides Mrs. Wells to believe in them, to give them a chance when they desperately needed one, to stand with them against corruption and violence when it would have been safer to look away. They found him in bed, propped up on pillows, looking small in a way that shocked Jim. Samuel Holloway had always seemed larger than life, a force of nature in human form. Seeing him reduced like this, seeing mortality written so clearly in his face, was like watching a mountain erode. But his eyes were still sharp, still aware, and when he saw them, he smiled. There they are, my favorite people who aren't Martha. Martha, sitting in a chair beside the bed, smiled through tears. He's been asking for you all morning, wore himself out, fretting that you wouldn't come in time. We're here, Rose said, taking his hand gently. We got your letter. Good, good. Samuel's breathing was labored, each word an effort. Did you read the part about the ranch? We did, Jim said. Samuel, that's too much. We can't accept. You can and you will. The old rancher's voice gained strength through sheer force of will. Don't argue with a dying man. It's ungentlemanly. But your family, there must be cousins, nephews, someone with a blood claim. Had a nephew once. Gambled away 3 fortunes and came asking for a 4th. I sent him packing and never regretted it. Samuel coughed, and Martha held water to his lips. Blood doesn't make family. Choice does. You chose to stop that day when Rose needed someone. You chose to stay when staying was dangerous. You chose to fight when fighting was hard. Those choices made you family, made you worthy of carrying on what Martha and I built. Jim felt his throat tighten. I don't know if I can fill your boots. You don't have to fill my boots. You have to wear your own. Samuel's grip on Rose's hand tightened slightly. And you, young lady, you're going to do something with your life, something that matters. I can see it in you, that strength, that refusal to quit. You rode out to help when you didn't have to. Put yourself at risk for a stranger. You weren't a stranger. You were a man who needed help. And that's why you're the right choice for this place. Samuel's eyes drifted closed, then opened again with effort. The ranch isn't just land and cattle. It's an idea. The idea that honest work matters, that keeping your word matters, that standing up for what's right matters even when it costs you. You live that idea, Jim, every day, and that's what I need passed on more than any amount of acres or livestock. I'll do my best. I know you will. Samuel's breathing slowed, became peaceful. That's all anyone can do, their best, and trust that it's enough. He died an hour later, with Martha holding one hand and Rose holding the other, with Jim standing witness to the passing of a good man in a world that needed more of them. He died peacefully, without struggle, like a man who'd earned his rest and was ready to take it. The funeral 3 days later brought people from across Montana territory, ranchers and shopkeepers, ranch hands and businessmen, people whose lives Samuel had touched in ways large and small. The territorial governor sent a representative. Federal marshals came to pay respects to a man who'd stood for justice when justice wasn't popular. Reverend Thomas, the new minister who'd replaced Blackwood, spoke about lives well lived and legacies that outlasted mortality, about how some men built monuments to themselves while others built communities, and how the latter mattered more, even if it was less visible. Jim stood with Rose and Martha, accepting condolences, shaking hands, hearing story after story about Samuel's generosity and fairness and unwavering moral compass. And with each story, the weight of what he'd inherited grew heavier. This wasn't just a ranch. It was a responsibility, a trust, a promise made not in words but in deeds, to carry forward everything Samuel had believed in and built. That night, alone in the cabin, while Rose slept and Martha stayed with relatives in town, Jim sat on the porch and wondered if he was equal to the task. Wondered if a man who'd spent 4 years running from responsibility could suddenly become someone worthy of this much trust. The answer came not in words, but in memory. Rose on those steps, waiting. Samuel offering him work when he needed it most. Marshal Whitmore standing up for justice, even knowing it might cost him his life. All these people who'd chosen courage over comfort, who'd done what was right, even when it was hard. He didn't have to be perfect. He just had to keep choosing, keep trying, keep showing up. That was all Samuel had ever asked of him. That was all anyone could ask of themselves. Morning brought Martha to the cabin with legal documents and a request. Samuel wanted you to rename the place. Said Circle H was his mark, and you should make your own. Jim hadn't thought about it. Hadn't imagined putting his stamp on something that had been Samuel's for so long. But as he looked at Rose making breakfast, at the land spreading out around them, at the future they were building together, a name came to him. The Promise Ranch, he said, for the promises we keep, the ones to each other, to the land, to the people who trusted us." Martha smiled through fresh tears. Samuel would have liked that, would have said it was fitting. The transformation took time. Learning to run a ranch was different from working on one. There were books to keep, decisions to make about breeding and buying and selling, relationships to maintain with buyers and suppliers and neighboring ranches. Jim made mistakes, plenty of them, but he learned from each one. Rose threw herself into the work with the same fierce determination she brought to everything. She could rope and ride as well as any ranch hand, could doctor a sick calf or deliver a foal with steady hands and steady nerves, could keep books and negotiate prices and spot a dishonest dealer from across a room. "You're good at this," Jim told her one evening, watching her tally the year's earnings with quick, accurate strokes. "I had a good teacher, 2 of them actually." She looked up from the ledger. "Pa taught me about craftsmanship and patience. You taught me about courage and staying. Samuel taught me about legacy and responsibility. Between the 3 of you, I got a pretty solid education." "What are you going to do with that education?" Rose set down her pen, considering. "I've been thinking about that, about what comes next, about what I want my life to be. And I want to stay here, want to run this ranch and make it thrive, want to prove that a woman can do it just as well as any man." She paused. "But I also want to help other people the way we were helped. Want to be the kind of person who stops when someone needs stopping for, who stands up when standing up is dangerous. Does that make sense?" Perfect sense. Jim felt pride swell in his chest so large it hurt. "Your father would be proud of you. Both your fathers." They sat together in comfortable silence, and Jim thought about how far they'd come. 5 years from those steps in Silver Creek to here, to this moment, to a future that stretched ahead, bright and possible, and theirs to shape. But the past, he was learning, never fully released its hold. It lived in memory, in lessons learned, in scars both visible and hidden. And sometimes it came back in unexpected ways. The stranger rode in on a Tuesday afternoon in late September, when the aspens were turning gold and the air held the first hint of winter's approach. He was young, maybe 20, with nervous eyes and hands that kept moving to his gun and away again. Jim was working in the corral when the young man dismounted, and something about his face nagged at recognition. Something familiar in the set of his jaw, the color of his hair. "Help you? Are you Jim Cole?" "I am." The young man swallowed hard. "My name's Daniel Keller. Frank Keller was my uncle." Ice flooded Jim's veins. He didn't move, didn't reach for his gun, but every muscle tensed for action. "That's so?" "Yes, sir. And I've come to say something I should have said 5 years ago." Daniel's hands came away from his gun, held open and empty. "I've come to apologize." Of all the things Jim had expected, this wasn't one of them. "Apologize?" "My uncles, all 3 of them, they were bad men. I know that now. Knew it then, really, but I was young and stupid, and I thought family loyalty mattered more than right and wrong." Daniel's voice shook, but he didn't look away. "They burned your house, killed your wife and daughter, and I knew about it." "Didn't help, didn't participate, but I knew, and I said nothing. That makes me guilty too." Jim stood very still, processing this. "Why are you here? Why now?" "Because 5 years ago, you killed Uncle Frank. And instead of coming after you for revenge like everyone expected, I started thinking about why he died, about what he'd done, about all the people my uncles hurt over the years." Daniel's eyes were wet now. And I realized I didn't want to be like them, didn't want to live that life. So I changed, got honest work, tried to be better. But I couldn't be fully better until I did this, until I faced you and said I was sorry and accepted whatever judgment you wanted to pass. Jim looked at this young man who'd carried guilt for 5 years, who'd traveled hundreds of miles to deliver an apology he didn't have to give, who'd put himself at Jim's mercy, knowing full well he might not leave alive. And Jim thought about promises, about the ones we make to ourselves, about who we want to be, about the ones we keep even when they're hard, about the ones that define us. "I forgive you," he said quietly. "You were young. You made a mistake by staying silent. But you didn't pull the trigger, didn't set the fire. And you've spent 5 years trying to be better. That takes courage." Daniel's knees nearly buckled with relief. "Thank you. God, thank you. But Daniel," Jim's voice hardened slightly, "if you ever slide back toward that life, if you ever hurt innocent people, forgiveness won't save you twice. Understand?" "Yes, sir. I understand. And I won't. I swear on my life." They shook hands, and Jim watched Daniel right away. Watched another piece of his past find closure, find peace, find resolution. And he understood, finally and fully, that this was how healing worked. Not in one grand moment, but in 1,000 small ones. Not in forgetting, but in choosing, again and again, to move forward while carrying the past with grace instead of bitterness. Rose found him still standing there an hour later, watching the horizon. "Who was that?" "A ghost," Jim said. "But a good one. One who came to make peace instead of war." "Are there going to be more? More ghosts? More dangers? More fights?" Jim considered lying, offering false comfort, but Rose deserved truth. Always had. "Probably. The world's full of trouble, and we seem to have a talent for finding it. Or it finding us. Then we'll handle it." She linked her arm through his. "Together, like always." "Together," Jim agreed. "Like always." They walked back toward the house as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson and purple so deep it looked like a bruise. Behind them, the Promise Ranch stretched across the valley, land they'd earned through courage and stubbornness and refusing to quit. Ahead lay tomorrow, and all the tomorrows after that, uncertain, dangerous, beautiful, full of possibility, full of challenges they'd face and overcome, or be overcome by, but never alone, never running, never hiding. 5 years ago, a man had stopped on store steps where a girl waited, had made a choice that changed everything, had kept a promise he didn't know he was making. Now they were here. Home, family, legacy. The girl who waited had become a young woman who built. The man who ran had become a man who stood. And together, they'd created something worth defending, worth dying for, worth living for. The last promise had been kept so many times it had become not a promise, but a way of life. A choice made new each morning to show up, to care, to fight for what mattered. And as darkness fell over the Promise Ranch, as stars emerged one by one in the vast Montana sky, Jim Cole and Rose Cole went inside together, not running toward anything or away from anything, but simply being. Being home, being family, being enough. The story that had begun with waiting ended with staying, with roots sunk deep, with a future built on foundations of courage and trust and love freely given and fiercely protected. It was enough, more than enough. It was everything, and it was theirs, forever.